welcome to Story's Room. Enjoy listening, and don't forget to subscribe. James sat by the living room window, listening to the autumn rain drumming against the glass. He couldn't help noticing how the drops ran downward, merging into each other and creating unusual patterns. Usually such details soothed him, helped him clear his head, but not today. It felt as if the whole world was exuding unease, and that rain was the soundtrack to the turmoil in his soul. For a week now, he had been unable to find peace. He woke up night after night in a cold sweat, with the sense that something irrevocable was looming in his life. Only a few months ago, he would have called himself a contented man. He owned a house outside the city, ran a successful construction company he'd built from the ground up, and was married to Helen for 8 years. It wasn't a perfect marriage, but he believed that, having gone through challenges together, they had become a reliable team. Recently, however, an invisible wall seemed to rise between them. Helen was absent-minded, avoiding eye contact when he tried to ask about her day, and spent far too much time at work, or so she claimed. He noticed she'd changed her perfume, and then that her wardrobe was updated with new items. Neither of those were crimes in themselves, but his instincts, sharpened by years of doing business, told him something was off. She had grown tense whenever he casually asked about her co-workers. Sometimes, to calm his nerves, he'd step outside to smoke, even though he'd nearly quit. He would stare at the dark sky, wondering if he was overreacting. After all, any relationship can get stuck in routine, people change. Yet deep down, he felt afraid. Night by night his sleep deteriorated, haunted by anxious dreams about strangers breaking into the house, or about Helen vanishing into the darkness. Once, he got up at night to get a glass of water and realized she wasn't in bed. He found her in the living room with her phone, claiming she couldn't sleep. But even then, her glance was uneasy. He knew he couldn't go on ignoring the signs. Yet trying to speak openly led nowhere, her answers felt cold. She said she was simply tired, and told him, "There's nothing to worry about." That phrase, "nothing to worry about," made his skin crawl. He'd never been the jealous type or a snoop, but now his suspicions were stronger than his pride. He pulled out the number of his old college friend, Michael, hoping for some reassurance. Michael was calm and sensible, always ready to lend an ear and advice. After hearing James's breathless account, Helen's lateness, her deflections, the general atmosphere, Michael suggested they meet up. James still clung to the hope it might be a temporary phase and ended up declining. Michael pointed out that if these suspicions were devouring him, a better approach might be to get concrete proof. That could include hiring a private investigator. The idea bothered James. He disliked the thought of spying on Helen, but he saw no other way. If she truly was betraying him, he'd rather be sure than spend every night plagued by doubts. The next morning, at his office, he was sorting through work documents when he accidentally came across some receipts listing purchases Helen had made at a florist and a jewelry store, on days she'd said she was stuck at work. James couldn't recall any new jewelry or talk of a shopping spree. His stomach churned. Perhaps she had bought him a present? But his birthday was a long way off, and nothing in her behavior suggested a secret gift. It looked more like a hidden life. Eventually, he called private investigator Richard Garrison, who came to see him around midday. Trim, dressed in a formal suit, Garrison asked precise questions about Helen's schedule and personality. James felt a knot of shame in his chest. He hated bringing in a stranger, but saw no alternative. Garrison promised to get right on it, explaining that he'd give James any tangible evidence he found. Then, quietly, he added a question: was James certain he wanted to go through with this, knowing it might confirm the worst? James, fighting the dread in his gut, nodded and signed the contract. Inside, he was trembling. The next few days were agonizing. He tried to keep the same demeanor around Helen while internally bracing himself for news from the detective. She herself seemed on edge, as though sensing he might be onto something. Any time she said she'd be working late or took a call in another room, James felt his hands grow clammy. Each passing evening, the tension wound tighter, as though a spring were about to snap. Garrison finally called, requesting a discreet meeting. They chose a small cafe at the edge of town, out of the public eye. As soon as they sat down, the investigator handed James a large envelope, explaining that it unambiguously confirmed his suspicions. James opened it, finding photographs of Helen leaving a restaurant in the arms of a man he didn't recognize. Garrison identified him as Thomas Wilkinson, the owner of a chain of auto shops. More photos showed them kissing. Others captured them entering a country house together. The timeline spanned the last few weeks and left no doubt. James felt his pulse thudding in his ears, so loudly it drowned out the world. He realized he was clenching his jaw so hard it hurt. Garrison detailed how Helen had stayed overnight with Thomas multiple times and asked James whether he wanted further surveillance. James murmured that this was more than enough, paid for the detective's services, and left, carrying the envelope. He sank into the driver's seat, staring at the damning photographs. Tears blurred his eyes. He had never felt so humiliated and crushed. Conflicting questions hammered at his mind: confrontation, divorce, or something worse? The notion of letting her go without some sort of retribution clenched his gut. He took a deep breath and drove home on autopilot. That evening, as he entered the house, Helen was already there. He held the envelope in his hand, half inclined to fling the photos in her face, but he paused. He'd expected to blow up at her, but now he wondered if he should wait, gather his thoughts, strategize. A wave of vengeful rage flickered deep within him. In the end, he muttered only, "We'll talk later," and went upstairs to his study. She, pale and tense, looked after him, but said nothing. Next day, he phoned Michael. After hearing the dismayed "So it's true, then," from his friend, James answered that yes, it was. Michael responded that maybe he should confront Helen at once about a divorce instead of living in torment. But James said he needed time to consider his next steps. Sensing an ominous note in his voice, Michael advised him to keep his head cool, not to do anything extreme. James thanked him but left the call feeling no calmer. He gazed down at the photographs once more, feeling waves of pain and fury. He pictured Thomas's face, arrogant, maybe smug about seducing another man's wife, and something inside James solidified into a bleak resolve. He would not let Thomas gloat, unpunished. He decided to investigate Thomas's background. Through business acquaintances, James discovered that Thomas had plenty of skeletons in his professional closet. His deals weren't exactly transparent, and rumor had it he laundered money via shell companies. That meant a gold mine of potential evidence to trigger legal trouble. So James devised a plan to attack Thomas systematically, file anonymous complaints, gather what incriminating documents he could, and feed them to journalists. If it wrecked Thomas's finances and reputation, so be it. James didn't expect it to bring him peace in a real sense, but at least it might keep Thomas from feeling he'd won. He told himself that was reason enough. Over the following weeks, James, using the help of contacts in financial and legal circles, assembled everything that might indicate Wilkinson's misdeeds. He spent late nights poring over documents, transferring tasks at his own business to deputies who were growing puzzled at his shift in focus. Whenever Helen was home, the tension between them was palpable. She sometimes tried to talk to him, seeming anxious, as though wanting to confess. But he gave her cold, clipped answers. Their marriage felt like a powder keg on the verge of exploding. Sometimes she slept at her sister's or a friend's, either to avoid James's brooding presence or to escape her own guilt. One evening she started to explain herself, only managing, "I'm sorry. I didn't plan this. It just happened." James seethed at the phrase, "it just happened," but kept calm, telling her he couldn't see how she could fix their marriage now. She cried in silence, eventually going to the guest bedroom. In the morning, she left even earlier than usual. As James compiled ever more evidence, he found himself experiencing an odd thrill, a twisted sense of satisfaction. The idea of Thomas facing criminal charges or official probes gave him a grim relief. Yet he was also starting to lose any sense of normalcy. His own business languished, and he no longer took joy in anything besides planning how to dismantle Thomas's world. Occasionally, Michael attempted to invite him out for a break, but James always refused. Then the day came when newspapers published their first investigative pieces about Thomas, referencing highly suspicious transactions. James had planted that information through back channels, and the coverage quickly attracted the attention of law enforcement agencies. Thomas was reportedly called in for questioning. In the local business community, speculation flared up, and potential investors in Thomas's ventures became skittish. James watched this play out with a cold, hollow triumph. He had secured anonymity, so no one officially linked him to the allegations. He kept tabs from the shadows, waiting for the next blow. He watched a news segment one evening. Thomas was at a charity event and was suddenly ambushed by reporters hurling tough questions about his dealings. The camera zoomed in on Thomas, visibly rattled, storming off. James sat on his couch, feeling both a surge of adrenaline and a wave of emptiness. My revenge is working, he thought, though the victory felt strangely barren. Things escalated further one night when someone rang James's doorbell, and there stood Thomas himself, eyes blazing, obviously furious. He accused James of orchestrating a smear campaign. James responded with a brusque question about whether Thomas had any proof. Thomas spat back, "You're the only one with a motive." James didn't bother to deny it but retorted that a motive didn't automatically mean wrongdoing. The tension exploded. Thomas shoved him, James retaliated with a punch. They ended up scuffling in the entryway. Blood spattered, James's lip was split, and Thomas had a cut on his cheek. Helen, who happened to be home, rushed in and shouted for them to stop. Thomas hurled threats at James, claiming he'd make him pay, then fled into the night. James, sitting on the floor, wiped blood from his mouth. Helen appeared with bandages, but he shoved her away in anger, telling her to go comfort her boyfriend. She gave him a broken look and retrieved antiseptic from the bathroom. After that, James realized Thomas might try something drastic. Thomas had become desperate, with legal troubles closing in and a damaged reputation, so perhaps he would lash out. James upgraded his home security, changed the locks, and asked an IT-savvy friend to help secure his devices. But Helen was deeply shaken by the altercation. Soon after, she said she was leaving to stay with her sister, claiming she feared everything had gone too far. He let her go without protest. One morning, a police officer phoned James to ask if he had any idea where Thomas might be because Thomas hadn't shown up for a scheduled interrogation. James said he didn't, he only knew they'd come to blows recently, and he wanted no more of it. After the call ended, James felt uneasy. If Thomas was avoiding the law, he might be planning to vanish, or worse, return unexpectedly in a final attempt at vengeance. Days later, James found a note in his mailbox, no return address, just a message in large handwriting: "Don't think you've won. This isn't over. I'll be back when you least expect it. T." A chill crawled up his spine. Here it was, a direct threat. He showed it to his lawyer, who again recommended going to the police, but James hesitated, not wanting to explain the full extent of his role in the situation. So he carried on, living in a state of permanent tension, double-checking the locks at night and jumping at every unexpected sound. Helen, for her part, was frightened too. From what James heard, she no longer saw Thomas at all, considering him too unstable. She tried to apologize to James a few times, but he remained distant. Her departure from the house became final, and an oppressive loneliness settled in. Even with Thomas likely on the run, James felt no relief, only the sense that he'd kicked over a hornet's nest. He found it hard to work, tossing and turning at night in an empty bed. One day, Emily, a friend of Helen's, appeared unannounced. She seemed anxious and explained she worried that Thomas could be dangerous and that James should be careful. James asked why she was there, what she expected. Emily said she hoped to talk sense into him, suggesting it wasn't too late to try a peaceful resolution rather than endless retaliation. He escorted her to the door, telling her it was far too late for peace. As she left, she murmured, "Don't let the darkness consume you." He stood in silence, left alone with that warning. He then learned through a contact that a criminal case had indeed been opened against Thomas, based on allegations of fraud and other offenses, and that Thomas was now a fugitive. Some of Thomas's key staff had turned on him to protect themselves. James realized that in legal terms, he had succeeded. Thomas's empire was imploding. Yet it all felt anticlimactic. Thomas was nowhere to be found, no public trial was underway. And James was left wrestling with insomnia and dread, aware that a cornered man might still strike back. The satisfaction he had initially felt had morphed into weariness and guilt. He spent many nights staring at the walls of his once cozy home, remembering how he had once cherished the place. Now it seemed so hollow. On impulse, he called Helen. She answered with a trembling voice, asking if he was okay. He said he was as fine as he could be, then fell silent. She softly suggested they finalize the divorce. He gave a weary sigh and murmured that she was probably right. The next morning, he admitted to himself that there was nothing else to do but make it official. She came by, both looked worn out. He told her, gently, that they should end it. He wouldn't fight over property or drag her name through the mud. She apologized, said she took responsibility for betraying him, and he merely nodded. The anger in him had subsided to a dull ache. She asked if there was any possibility to fix things, but he answered that it felt too late. Eventually, she said she'd file the papers, and he agreed to sign. She left, eyes rimmed with tears. They went through the divorce without much public drama, splitting assets more or less amicably. Helen moved in with her sister, and James was left with the big suburban house he had once been so proud of. He tried to immerse himself in work, setting his company back on track. After a month or two, at a friend's urging, he took a short trip out of town. Alone by a tranquil river, he spent hours reflecting on what had happened. He concluded that all his fury and plotting had not truly healed him. Yes, Thomas had been forced out of business, presumably facing eventual charges, but it hadn't brought closure or resurrected James's marriage. He felt only a lingering emptiness. Half a year passed, and James gradually stopped thinking about Helen all the time. Michael noticed he was at least a little more like his old self, though quieter, less easygoing. Sometimes he heard secondhand that Helen missed him or regretted everything, but he brushed it off. It was too late to go backward. He had no idea where Thomas was, only that he might still be on the run. James slept with one eye open, worried about that letter threatening revenge, though as time went on, the fear became less acute. One day, he and Michael had coffee, and Michael said, "You cornered Thomas, but look who ended up suffering the most." James gave a sad smile. "I guess me," he replied. He realized, yes, he'd inflicted some punishment on Thomas, but had lost so much himself in the process. Late at night, he still sometimes dreamt of Helen. He'd awaken with a pang of sorrow, recalling how they had once planned to have children, to grow old together. That was now irrevocably lost. He sold the suburban house and got a smaller place closer to the city, hoping it would be less fraught with memories. Sometimes, at social gatherings, acquaintances would ask if he had any regrets. He would say, "Maybe I should have tried a different approach, actually talk things through." But when betrayal hits you, you can't always be rational. He was at least relieved that he'd not gone down any path involving real violence or worse. Over a year after the divorce, James finally felt ready to meet new people. He didn't let himself get close to anyone too quickly, but over time, he lightened up. If someone complained about marital troubles, he advised them, talk. Sort it out before it's too late. Don't jump straight to vengeance. Some recognized bitterness in his words, but also a hint of wisdom learned the hard way. He occasionally heard rumors that Helen felt truly guilty for what she'd done. He didn't rejoice in that. He had moved on, though from time to time, a slight pain surfaced, as if pressed by an old bruise. The entire saga with Thomas, gathering incriminating documents, seeing his rival publicly shamed, and watching his own life unravel, had taught him that revenge, even if well executed, leaves emotional wreckage in its wake. Yet he also told himself that love, once shattered, rarely resurrects just by turning the other cheek. He sat alone one evening in his new apartment, finishing a glass of wine. Outside, the last remnants of winter were melting, and spring was in the air. He stared at the empty wall, remembering how he used to keep photos of him and Helen at their wedding, on vacations, images of happier days. He had destroyed or packed away most of them. There was no sense reviving those memories. He closed his eyes, letting out a long sigh, acknowledging that he was tired of hatred, tired of regrets. The next morning sunshine would bring a new day. Perhaps, in time, he would learn to trust again. That was how his story ended, a marriage broken, a lover disappeared, a quest for vengeance that succeeded legally yet left him hollow. He accepted that this was his reality. Sometimes it's not about winning or losing but about understanding that no revenge can fully repair what betrayal shatters. He reminded himself that people were imperfect. They made mistakes, took wrong turns, got carried away by resentment. And sometimes, after the storm, all you can do is let the old wound scar over and try to live differently. He hoped that, with each passing day, the world would once more seem like a place of possibility. Maybe new love would come along, a better, more mature kind. Maybe Helen would also find peace somewhere, having learned from her own mistakes. As for Thomas, only fate knew what awaited him. James suspected that, wherever Thomas was, he would bear the consequences of his own actions. And that was enough for James. He saw no further point in fueling the feud. At the end of it all, that house outside the city stood silent, no longer bearing witness to the illusions of happiness once shared there. Life had moved on. James sometimes thought about it, if only to remind himself that some lessons come at a steep cost. He had glimpsed how easily love could invert into bitterness and how revenge, no matter how cunning or justified, rarely brings true resolution. Even so, he was alive, he was free, and he was determined to find meaning beyond the heartache. That's the end of our story. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to stay up to date on new stories, and share this video so others can discover these great stories too.